Так, я попрошу.
Okay, so I would like to have your attention, please. And I would like to open the session and introduce to you that wonderful, our long-term expert, who is Marek Dabrowski. First of all, I would like to extend to him our gratitude, and he is a professor of the High School of Economics now too, but despite his very busy schedule, he always finds a chance to come to us, even when he didn't work with the school before. For non-economists, but for those people who are interested in economics, those who are interested to learn about the transition, that long transition, and Natalia Zabarevich before gave us some hints of how long it may last. And Marek is an economist. He's a true economist, and he was at the onset of economic reforms, both in Poland and in the Russian Federation, and he is one of the unique specialists in the field of the science. And those other economists who are familiar with, they all praise him for his high professionalism and knowledge. As many experts growing from the Gaidar times, he gave a lot of recipes and advice and helped to straighten up the situation in Russia and also in other former Soviet republics. And I think that today, Marek, you will speak for 30 minutes, and he will speak on the topic that he suggested for the workshop, and it will be followed by a Q&A session. Just meet the true professor in economics. So following the coffee break, please try to engage all your intellectual capabilities. And once again, I would like to stress that we have the pleasure of the company of Polish experts, and who has a very deep knowledge in Russian economy. Sometimes his knowledge is better than those of Russian economists. So we are talking about those things in global context. So let's be optimistic about that, and perhaps Marek can give us some hint or tell us something the opposite. Thank you very much, Lena, and I would like to say that it's always after that warm introduction by Lena Nemirovskaya, you feel elevated so high that the person is not quite sure that he can meet the expectations. But I'll try. To the best of my knowledge, you had a number of sessions already moderated by Russian economists, focusing on the Russian economy, and I will certainly be prepared to take your questions based on my knowledge of the Russian economy. However, I decided, and I got an approval of the school's organizers to speak in a more global context, because in global world, not a single country is capable of developing independently from the global context, since all countries, all economies are very well intertwined. And for that end, we need to understand all those global prospects. To begin with, I would like to warn you that I will not sound very much optimistic in my presentation, which may look odd, since throughout my life I tried to be perhaps not the greatest optimist, but at least a caution optimist. But recently my optimism has been diminishing. But as for the topic I'd like to speak on, I'll at least try to explain to you why that optimism is diminishing. To begin with, I would say that for the past 7 years at least, the global economy has been experiencing some serious shocks. You can argue about that downturn, whether it's comparable with the Great Depression of 1930s, or perhaps we saw some other serious problems following World War II. I think we had some, for instance, in 1970s, following the disintegration of the Bretton Woods system and following the oil crisis, high rate of inflation. In early 1980s, we also saw some dramatic attempts to bring economies of various countries, those of the United States, UK, and Europe, into the macroeconomic equilibrium. We saw financial and banking system crises in many countries. So it's hard to say, but the downturn that started in 2007 was really universal. It affected nearly all the world. And secondly, even if the depth of that crisis at the beginning was not as deep as that of the Great Depression, when the GDP of the United States dropped by 25%, but its duration makes us think that the crisis is not overcome yet. Here is a brief history of the crisis. We should recall that on the eve of the crisis in 2003 through 2007, we saw the highest ever growth in global economy. But even before that time, some economies were developing quite well in 1990s in the United States, in Asia. But we saw an Asian crisis of 1997, the so-called dot-com crisis. And in 2001 there was a crisis in IT area in the United States, but starting from 2003, virtually all the world had been showing quite a high growth, but it so happened that that growth was not stable. So in 2007 the crisis started with a downturn in the real estate market. First it looked like a local crisis, and people believed that it would affect only part of the sectors, and they didn't think that it would kill all the banks who had dealt with the subprime mortgage loans for those borrowers who didn't have a good credit rating. However, it took only half a year, and at the beginning of 2008, it so happened that all those sectors were very well intertwined. It was not only of the subprime lenders, and it related to the major investment banks of the United States, but also those of Japan and West Europe and some banks in Asia. They were all involved in those high-risk lending transactions in the real estate market in the United States and in other countries. So in the second half of 2008, the crisis stretched and covered the entire global economy, and Lehman Brothers was the starting point. You can also argue about that, because even in the spring of 2008, we saw another bankruptcy, Bering Straits, one of the major US banks. And after that, it appeared that for the first time since 1980s, both global GDP and global commerce volumes dropped, and the world entered the crisis, and it was followed by the crisis in the commercial sphere and in the sector of real economy. The U.S. authorities rendered a massive financial bailout, and joined by other Western banks, it made it possible to overcome that crisis. And starting from the second half of 2009, the U.S. economy and those of other countries showed some rally. So in 2010, looked not bad first, based on figures and numbers, but we saw another stage of the crisis. That's the sovereign debt in Europe, and in literature, in discussions, it is perceived as a crisis of the peripheral countries of the Eurozone, although I don't agree with that. Euro is strong, and it never lost its value. On the opposite, there were times, and even in the recent months, there was the rise of euro against US dollar. I think by and large, it was the crisis of the state policies of sovereign debts, and which was growing before the crisis, and in the times of crisis, the shrinking of GDP, social expenditures posed quite a problem in such countries, in some countries such as Ireland and Spain, UK, United States, the QE started to help banks straighten up the situation. So Europe was trying to counter the crisis, but till summer of 2013, the crisis was quite acute. But since then, at least in the area of GDP dynamics, there was a rally, a relative rally. But the question is whether the crisis is over or not, and still an open question. And people think of various scenarios and options. Many experts are afraid of the following thing. I agree with them, and they are afraid that the crisis would spread to emerging markets. Last year, we saw some of the symptoms of that, when India and Indonesia were very close to a serious financial crisis. They managed to stop that, but still, many countries, under various reasons, they are viewed as countries in the zone of risk. It's Turkey, it's India, it's Russia, it's Brazil, South Africa, the Middle East countries, Ukraine, in the European Union, it's Hungary. But time will tell. And I don't want to be a pessimist here and profit that there will be a crisis, but such an opportunity exists. On the other hand, there is always a possibility of the recurrence of the crisis in the Eurozone and in the European Union as a whole, because the rally is very slow, and there are some fundamental reasons for that. And sovereign debt remains high, and there are some bad assets in the banking sector that have not been addressed yet. Here is the dynamics of the global GDP. The first half of 1980s performance was quite bad. It was the period after oil shocks, oil crisis, and high interest rate in the United States and in the Western world. In their attempt to combat high inflation rate. It was the time when crisis struck Latin American markets and other emerging markets. However, in the second half of 1980s, we saw some growth, and then we saw another recession, and growth rates became lower. And it resulted in a recession in the United States and the stagnation that started in Japan. Then global economic growth was in the range of 3 to 4 percentage points. But in the second half of 1990s, the growth in emerging countries was overtaken that in developed countries, and the situation remains to be the same till now. Specifically, it was obvious in the crisis years in 2008, 2009, 2010. But the global crisis affected also the emerging markets and developed countries, but much less than the developed countries. If we look at the latest forecast of the International Monetary Fund of April this year, you can see here that the gap will continue to grow, meaning that emerging markets and developing countries will grow faster than advanced economies. And I think it is true, it is correct, since that's the growth can be explained that those countries are trying to catch up with the developed or advanced countries. But the forecast is still optimistic that the developed countries would grow, perhaps not at the rate of 3 to 4%, but at least at the rate of 2%. And the global economy as a whole will be showing the growth of about 4%. I'm not certain that it will really happen. I think it's quite an optimistic scenario, and in the later remarks I'll try to substantiate my skepticism about that. On this slide you can see basic regional groups of emerging markets and developing countries. You can see here that the main growth of the emerging markets comes from the emerging markets and developing countries of Asia. Mostly it's about China and India and Indonesia, probably, Vietnam and some other countries. That's shows us that there is the dominating role of Asia in global economy, and it's not something that is new. It started back in 1990s. But the second group of countries showing highest growth rate is Sub-Saharan Africa. And it means that Africa is getting out of the dozens of years of stagnations. I would add here that in Africa, a lot depends on political factors. Political factors really slow down growth in some countries, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan. That's the issue of the civil peace and tranquility and stability in those countries. Third region showing highest growth rate in North Africa and Middle East, including Afghanistan and Pakistan. In Latin America, growth rates are much lower, a little bit more than 3%. But the other two regions that are most interesting to us, it's CIS countries, slowest rate, and in emerging and developing Europe, growth rate is a little bit higher. I can explain that the World Economic Outlook refers to emerging and developing Europe. They include some new members of the European Union, except for those who are already members of the Eurozone, and the Czech Republic, that in the classification is believed to be a developed advanced country. So Hungary, Poland, Lithuania are included. There is also Bulgaria, and there are some candidates for EU membership, such as Turkey, Poland, and Romania. They really have the bulk of the weight in this aggregate number. So if we look at this regional aggregation, the things are not that optimistic. Like in the rest of the emerging markets and developing countries. And so Asia and Africa, they are also leader in those dynamics. However, I would like to make a point that all those projections are based on the typical forecasting models, which account for the factors of demand and offer. They are based on state orders, state demand, investments. And in this respect, the focus of economic discussions is that we need to revive demand so that we could improve and further develop production and increase GDP. So it brings us to the aspect of fiscal and monetary policies. I don't have time to go in details and discuss theoretical foundations of the issue. I'm not going to think about Keynesian theory and its combination with other theories. But as a matter of fact, such an approach makes sense only if actual growth is lower than the potential one, meaning that the significant part of economy of production facilities are not producing anything because of the lack of demand. However, it's hard to defend such a hypothesis. It's true that following the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in 2008, it was a great shock on the part of demand, collapse of the financial system, fall of the money multiplier, and so there was really the problem on the part of demand. and the monetary policies of leading banks and the Federal Reserve System, European Central Bank and Central Bank of Japan had to respond with the increase of the money supply. But in the subsequent years, and now it's hard to say that that kind of growth that we saw in recent years, and that is forecast, is lower than the potential. And I'm afraid that the projected growth is even higher than the potential is, and I'll try to explain why. The economic theory, such as neo-classic theory of growth by Robert Solow, there are three factors for economic growth. It's labor, capital, and total factor productivity. So those are the growth factors: technological advance, some better technologies and all that. Let's see how we can really look into the future based on the three factors. First comes labor. In developed countries, we see demographic crisis, as well as in the countries with an average per capita income. Those are all the European countries. And one generation later, Turkey may join that category as well. What is interesting to mention is that China, starting from 2017, and here is the UN forecast on the population growth, starting from 2012. So that forecast and green line indicates Europe. So it is turning to the bottom since the start of this millennium. In China, labor numbers will start dropping from 2017, and that's a result of the one family, one child policy. In North America, that process will go not that fast, and in the United States, including Mexico. In the United States, thanks to migration, population growth continues. But the reproduction factor in that country is higher than 2. So more or less, it's on the level of conventional reproduction. But fast population growth will continue in South and Central Asia. It's mostly India and Pakistan. It will also continue in Africa and in the Middle East.
And the Middle East and North Africa. The countries that have so far, for the past 100 or 200 years, were the locomotives of the growth of the world economy, of the global economy, namely the countries of Europe and the United States. And then the Asiatic tigers of the past several decades will encounter the very sharp shortage of labor, qualified labor, which can partially be resolved through migration flow, but there are, of course, different problems associated with this high rates of immigration for that, including the cultural, social, and socio-economic conditions. There are some internal sources, such as an increase in the pension age and the coefficient of employment, especially for the women. And this is a problem which is being considered very seriously in different countries, including in Southern Europe, in Asia and the Middle East. However, even then the efforts will have to be taken and the political will have to be demonstrated. If we look at the processes of economic growth from a different perspective, the global growth and the rates and the GDP for a particular country may be more or less prestigious because China is the second largest potentially economy in the world, and India is number 4. But what is important here is the GDP per capita. And the situation will be somewhat different here because the growth of the GDP will be lower, but on the other hand, with lowering populations such as Japan and some European countries will look differently. But of course, apart from the GDP statistics, there are also other problems. The problem of the debt. Both public debt and private debt growing, the diminishing population may help solve this problem partially, but only partially. Another factor is the factor of investment. If we look at the investment into the material assets, you'll see that there is a gradual decrease in the world economy as to the ratio between the investments and the GDP. You can see this red line here of this trend. It shows that over the past 30 years, the investments have gone down. But if you look at the major regions, you'll see that in the developed countries, in the advanced economies, the pink line, it goes down. But it is growing in the emerging markets. Especially in China, and in China over the past several years the investment level for the GDP, which is of course an absurd number. There are some statistical doubts, but one is clear that this is not a sustained growth, that as long as the demographic transition occurs, and as the society and the population grow older, and with the social programs, the amount of savings will diminish. This has been shown by the experience of Japan, and Japan has the highest level of savings, but it has gone down over the past 30 years by about 13%. Excuse me, 0.13%. So you can see still that if you look at specific countries, you will see that in China and India, this mean values are increased at their expense. Well, to think about the growth of investments, they have to be financed macroeconomically, especially on the global scale. And you have to see how the gross savings look like. There are exporting countries and importing countries, but the balance should be struck somewhere. And I can say yet again that there is a mirror by the regions. This is primarily Asia and the Southeastern Asia, China primarily, where the national savings have been above the GDP growth level. And the second region is Middle East and North Africa, which has been growing primarily at the expense of the oil production. With the growth of our oil prices in the 1990s, part of this were accumulated as savings, especially in the Gulf countries. One other thing. Some of this gross product is consumed by the budget deficit, which has gone up in many countries for the past 6 years. And one can say that that in these developed countries the savings level was not particularly high, and the demand for the budget financing will continue to rise. The third factor, we should remember as to what is changing. The politicians and the experts have access to the experience when they think about the experience of the 1990s and the past 10 years. They're prompted that in the 1990s the aggregate growth was quite high due to several single-use factors. First, liberalization of trade, and the so-called Uruguay Marrakesh Treaty of 1994, which in 10 years through different measures became a part of the trade agreements. As late as several years ago, for instance, in textile production, the 1994 treaties still had their influence, but this is now past. Even during the worse than that, during the global crisis of 2008, there was a temptation of protectionism. Although it did not exacerbate the situation, but I think, generally speaking, the enemies of trade liberalization gained a stronger footing. And the Ratsdocher negotiations ended after 12 years in December of last year with a very limited treaty, which only deals with one issue, such as the trade facilitation and the facilitation of the customs procedures. How will it work in practice, we do not know, but the effect is not particularly tangible. The main components of this agenda have stayed unresolved, such as electronic trade, state procurements, agricultural trade, and so on and so forth, have been left beyond the framework of this treaty, and it is not quite clear as to how long will this be continuing to function. Another thing that helped very much the markets worldwide was the liberalization of the capital movement, which occurred, of course, at the end of the 1990s. But as I said, these were single-time injections or instances which are now past and no longer significant from the standpoint of global development. So, but however, we are not to expect any revolutionary influence, and there is even a temptation in several countries to return to capital controls and for macroeconomic or other political reasons. So it is to be expected that the achieved progress should be sustained, and that's probably the only thing that one can hope for at the moment, rather than any revolutionary steps forward. Well, as we understand, many regions in the world, including Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space, and of course China, India, Latin America, partially Africa, partially Middle East, have conducted economic reforms, of which some were quite radical in the 1990s and the end of 1980s. This wave has also been left behind us. This factor has already been used. The technological revolution, the so-called network or IT revolution related to the communication businesses and the information technologies. I'm not an expert in this, but according to different analyses, and the economic growth in many of these countries. But one can expect that this is also behind us. The significance of this factor ended around 2003 and 2004. Now, of course, we're seeing different kinds of innovations, smartphones, the touchpads, but these are more incremental changes rather than any fundamental changes in the consumption sphere, rather than revolutionary changes in the modes of production. So I do not foresee any specific changes to occur in the immediate perspective. Many historians argue that usually technological revolution can only be understood or exposed through time. These revolutions that have taken place starting from the first industrial revolution in England, they have never been prognosed or foreseen before. But when you look at the perspective of, say, 5 years and not 50 years, then you do not expect anything radically new to come up. In the 1990s, there was another momentous event, which was, of course, the peace dividend resulting from the end of the Cold War. But starting from this new century, starting from the war on terror and starting from especially the past times, this factor is most probably working in the opposite direction. When the countries have gone back to raising their military budgets and flexing their military muscle, even the very measures aimed at the struggle against terrorism definitely impair the freedom of trade. And one should not expect much in this sphere in terms of the easing of the hurdles. Well, not to be a complete pessimist and to try and deliberate as to what can be done to support some growth, especially those that have met with the demographic barriers. Let me start with the general thing. First of all, the World Trade Organization, WTO, and to get a true progress along the lines of the WTO. I am not going to analyze this in any detail, but it appears that we are so far confined to some sectorial interests of different countries, such as the agricultural sector of the United States, which was a very protectionist country up until very recently. And this might change a little bit, or Japan, which has been defending its market, especially the rice market. It is difficult but possible. After we have finished the financial sector reforms, I think that you can see some results extracted from the experience of the developed countries that can always be can be sparked. Well, it is clear that during the sanitary measures for the financial sector and the so-called deleveraging, which is the decrease in the load of financial mediation, does not help the growth. So I think that the completion of this process could have helped to enter a more stable period of growth. A better coordination of macroeconomic policies between countries. There is nothing revolutionary here, of course, because the perspective of creating a planetary government is still a chimera. It is unrealistic. However, within the bonds of the existing institutions, blocks, the IMF, the G20, there can be certain agreements and better coordination. For instance, to prevent and to avoid the hard currency wars for the purposes of getting some short-term profit for one of the actors. Such better coordination may be a thing of progress. One other thing which seems like science fiction today is a better organization and coordination of the immigration flows, which is especially difficult in Europe because Europe has to make agreements with the Middle Eastern countries, but this may be an even greater challenge in Asia, in countries like Japan and Korea, which are undergoing a demographic decline, but which nevertheless are not prepared to encourage immigration. The question about definition of partial democratic tendencies, the increase of pension age, reform of the healthcare system, which is also made up of some conditional responsibilities, and clearly all those who work pay into the healthcare foundations, but of course the pensioners are the major consumers of the medical services, and as the societies grow older, there is a general increase in such costs for the co-payments, the co-pays, and of course the high labor costs. In countries of, say, Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, a paradoxical situation emerges when, on the one hand, the active population is in decline and diminishes. On the other hand, there's a high level of unemployment. Why? Because there are different systems of stimuli. The labor code, the labor legislation, and the different social benefits and payments, which decrease the stimulation and which the different groups feel themselves not particularly high. So these markets appear to be over-regulated. The social burden will continue to grow because this burden may become unbearable. The reform of the financial sector I've already mentioned, and the re-regulation in some sectors such as the agriculture and food industries, pharmaceutical industry, where there are too many barriers which theoretically should serve the consumers, but in essence protect the producers from extra competition. However, in countries with the developing markets, there are some very similar problems, and some problems are quite specific. The specific problems that we should enumerate is, of course, the poor business climate and poor state management and political arrangement, including corruption, organized crime, and transaction costs, high transaction costs, which indeed influence with all these emerging markets. The trade protectionism, which is a part of the policies in Brazil, Russia, but also elsewhere. There are also countries which have the problem of populism, too much of a social burden, not particularly targeted. And Venezuela is one of the most conspicuous examples over the past decades. Being a rich oil-producing country, it is almost defaulting, just like Argentina, because of this populist politics. The Ukraine is one of such a vivid example. Over the past years, where it seemed several years ago that the macroeconomic stability in Ukraine, in many countries has been resolved, but the global crisis and its consequences have shown us otherwise. Our next point here are the shortages and the drawbacks of infrastructure, including the inability of the existing technologies and the existing infrastructure to cope with the burden. There's also the problem of capital, which is, of course, a major problem in Africa and Middle East, and in Latin America in part. The underdeveloped financial markets and the limitation of the foreign investment. In many countries, we're seeing a large state sector. I'm specifically talking about the state property sector, such as in Russia and elsewhere, where the state's property sector is expanding rather than getting narrower. And finally, the regional conflicts. Today's conflict in Ukraine is not by far the only conflict. There's a whole number of cases that one should mention, among others, the crisis in Georgia and the unresolved territorial disputes in Georgia, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Cyprus and elsewhere, which definitely have their adverse economic effects. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, colleagues. Let us start with the questions and answers session. Our colleague from Germany is given the floor. He has been rehabilitated today.
Yeah, I very much like to conversate always with you. So I'm enjoying the time with all with you. So it's a great meeting here. So I really like the Russian hospitality, Russian culture. So my question regards the link between economics and politics, so there's a strong link in every country, in Russia not less than in other countries. So if there's no political certainty, the economic system will not working well. So foreign investments go back, and all this thing. So as I see at the moment, Russia, as we also heard the last days, Russia is more like organized like a pyramid with a strong autocratic system. So there's one strong head. This probably has the reasons, but this makes the system as well sick towards shocks. So what's happened when the main head goes once away? So do you see this link between the current political system and economics, and how do you see or how do you would predict it for the next future for Russia? Would there be any problem, or?
Сразу отвечаем, да? Very broad and difficult question. Как мне отвечать? На русском? Не, ну удобно, наверное. Ну, я понимаю, что большинство все-таки лучше.
Большинство русскоязычные здесь, конечно.
Да. Значит, вопрос.
I will take up the liberty to answer in Russian to the benefit of the audience. There is definitely a link between the quality of the political system and the quality of the economic system. Historically speaking, we can speak about the examples of the authoritarian regimes which implemented market reforms such as Chile, Korea, China, to a certain extent, which is a post-communist authoritarian regime which did implement market reforms. However, in the context of the region where we all are, which is the Central and Eastern Europe and the former USSR countries, it is difficult to give examples of an authoritarian regime that would be conducive to market reforms. Maybe Kazakhstan is such an example, but we can still deliberate if that might be a happy example.
In this sense, I'm sorry I didn't take along with me the spreadsheet where we presented data that shows graphic correlation between the degree of political freedom according to Freedom House and economic freedoms, or ratings by EBRD or Heritage Foundation. And what they have there is, it's not that we have a full correlation, but we see around this curve 45 degrees, it all fits in. With the exception, as I say, of Kazakhstan, there are several countries of Central and Eastern Europe where the level of political freedom is higher than the level of economic freedoms. But the question is what measures we take. Secondly, if we look at the dynamics, here we could give larger number of examples how democratization helped democracy reforms. For example, Slovakia, or for example, Serbia, Yugoslavia and then Serbia, after Milosevic left. And on the other side, how return to authoritarianism puts a brake on the reforms and turns them back. This is where Russia serves the best example. Thirdly, what are the prospects? I actually don't do projections and haven't done it for a while, especially political projections and forecasts, but I would put it this way. There is quite a large bulk of literature, first of all works by Robert Barrow and others, who say that the opposite is true. Economic growth, it increases demand for democratic institutions. The more and more countries, they need democratic change. Certainly there are corrections that need to be made. one of those factors that this is oil resources. This is regrettably the case of Russia. But if somebody asks me about the year 2030, I think that Russia will still be a democratic and liberal country. But when it happens exactly, I do not know the date. Dear colleague, you now have the floor. Thank you. Ostrovsky Konstantin from Kaliningrad. You spoke about risks of trade migration in the EU, but you spoke about the external character. In my view, there is a problem about uneven trade migration. For example, in the Baltics, many young specialists left. Say in the last 6 months, 500,000 people left Latvia, although this figure is not widely publicized. But my question is, tell me please what measures can take care of this situation, and if not return them back, how can maybe we can plant all Baltics with the corn and maize, but this was the case in Khrushchev's time, but will it help? Well, this is where I showed you how EU as an aggregate, it's just Europe and Russia as an as a tool, aggregated data. Within the EU, one of the principles is when people, since we see difference in the level of income and this explains internal migration. So here I'm not really a great specialist in migration, so I would find it hard to discuss figures and proportions and dynamics. But this process is certainly underway, and it certainly will be there, but it will be just as we see processes happening like convergence within. Again, 2 weeks ago, I took a part in a conference in Florence that discussed to which extent countries in Eastern and Western Europe, how they could do it in the last 10 years. Opinions here differ, but convergence certainly did take place in terms of, especially in terms of the level of personal income calculated per euro or other currencies. So I suppose because of that, these internal forces, that identify external flows of migration, they will certainly change. New countries will enter EU and they will first supply new labor, which does not address the strategic problem, because if all of Europe will sees decline in population, including former Soviet republics, and very soon this will be something that Turkey will see. So surely they will have some inner migration like what we see in individual countries. This is something that we see, but Europe will need internal migration, and the only realistic source of this external migration is Arabic world and Africa. Because from East Asia, I don't suppose anybody will be traveling. Latin America, it's pretty far away. Gravitation is towards the United States, to Canada, and thus this is where it's a natural like movement, and it's there. Despite all the measures when they seek to forbid it or put in place fences and try to isolate it and patrol from the Mediterranean, but this is something that is coming closer and closer and stronger. Aidevik Markarian now has the floor. Professor, thank you very much for this very informative and exciting presentation. My question is as follows. If I go back to your slide number 1, we can see that the economy is in a global and non-interrupted crisis beginning with the year 2003. And as far as I understand, there is certain structural need for this. But at the same time, if you look at the graphs of global economy growth, we can... This uninterrupted crisis that they promote health and growth of China, that is now economy number 2. And from 2010, India and Brazil have been growing steadily too. Tell me, please, since we're being number 6 or 7, how would you comment on this situation? And under this situation, Russia and its potential, could they be interesting for BRICS countries or not? In my understanding, rapid development of China and India is not something that follows from the crisis. Yes, we must say, short-term effect would be seen like this, like in the year 2009, that saw the fall in in market growth in developed countries, whereas growth rates in China, although they remained positive and strongly positive, still they declined. And the process somewhat of the convergence will be seen and it accelerated for 2 years, but it started much sooner. In China, it started back in the times of Deng Xiaoping reforms, maybe 1981. And in India, it began in the early 1990s. Whereas in the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen it more difficult because they exhausted the factors that promoted growth. But this process, we can look at it from a very different perspective, historic perspective. If we look at the well-known historic and statistic calculations, like, regrettably, this researcher died several years ago, and the publications were in 2004, where the researcher showed that in 1820, which is almost 200 years ago, on the eve of the general industrial revolution of the first wave, China, if I'm not mistaken, had, like, its share in the global economy was about 35%. India had something like 14%, Japan 2-3%. In general, Asia was accounting for some 60% of the global economy at that time. 30% and something on top of that. That was UK and continental Europe, first of all, Western Europe. The US accounted for 1%, maybe less. But I think that we today are seeing the rebound historic balance. We understand what happened in China, in India, which saw the end of colonialism. We see times of trouble, domestic trouble in China, and the Japanese-Chinese war. It's all clear that happened in the 19th and 20th century. Now they are seeing a rebound and a recovery. And I think that the process is right, because the world as a whole will be more stable and I hope more peaceful, unless we see this huge gap in terms of levels of development as something that we saw 30 years ago. Nowadays, Russia, to which extent it's an interesting partner? Well, you know, I'm not really an expert on external economic relations of Russia, but if you look at the statistics, the chief trade partner of Russia is EU. Second is CIS. China, I think, is number 3. India, Brazil is just their share is very, very small. But we do understand that it determines trade flows. It determines complementarity, ability to complement one another among economic structures, and again geographic proximity and the presence of transport links. What is clear that, for example, in case of Russia and India, today it's not something seen. Again, in case of China, the trans-border links would be closer, but again, this is a territory that Siberia is not the most developed country, part of Russia. But this is where I think the potential is probably just because China's and India's share in global economy will grow, and this is where it's going to grow because of the factors that I just named. Well, Dagestan. I'm from Dagestan. My question is, can we speak today about improving investment situation in the world when in point of fact there are no guarantees that deposits would be maintained? The situation with the Cyprus is a good example where people could not guarantee that their deposits might not be lost. Well, you touched upon a very much a sophisticated question. The system of deposit insurance, yes, it is indeed ensuring greater safety of the deposits, but it also creates great risks. The best example is Ireland, where on the eve of the crisis, because of the panic, the government gave 100% guarantee to deposits. But what turned out later on is that those guarantees were immediately demanded because nobody really understood what a major problem the banking system of this country is facing. In Cyprus, yes. But this is again a different story. This could be viewed from a different perspective. Those who say that the conditions that were put forward to Cyprus, the conditions for financial support were different from what was in Greece, Portugal, or say Ireland. But on the other side, we can say that this long-term perspective, the program just to address and resolve the Cypriot banking crisis, it opened up a new approach with which I place great hopes. This is where they, for the first time, introduced the principle of correspondence to major creditors, bank creditors. I suppose it is right. Otherwise, we will never see major financial institutions, major banks and other financial institutions. They will just, the syndrome which we call too big to fail. In principle, the government and the budgets of different countries become hostages. And in principle, this is something that is now actively discussed in the EU, within the EU, the principle of co-participation of creditor banks in resolving their possible bankruptcy. It decreases the risks. This is what we call moral hazard. Colleague, are you from Krasnodar, if I remember correctly? Sergei Burtsev from Krasnodar. Are you also from Krasnodar? Yes? Amazing, surprising. Okay. Sergei, please. Regional question is, tell me please, if any global events such as the Olympics, Formula One, Universiade Games and summits, do they influence investment attractiveness, and can we evaluate them? I understand that image plays the most important role, but probably investors are more interested in a country which is successful as a host of these major events. Is it image of investment attractiveness, or is it more for the region that held this event? Well, I was lucky. I was never really into it at all. And if I see all kinds of participant by economists in the discussion of these issues, I immediately get a suspicion that they're not probably objective, probably the ones that order are overpaying. I'll put it, the findings of this expert evaluation. What I mean here, yet another Olympic Games, another championship, soccer championships, and another European Championship on soccer and all other events. I think that here, I personally doubt, but this is pure intuition. I'm confident that this is a good business of the International Olympic Committee, FIFA, UEFA, and all those international bodies. Quite nice business for those who immediately provide services there, say hotels, restaurants, all these services go into construction of these sites, advertising, PR, all these matters. Probably from the perspective of the image of this region or this or other city, this matters too, but those who pay, usually it's the taxpayer who picks the bill. And they I very strongly doubt that they get back return on investment. But there are interesting examples. I don't remember when, say, Olympic Games in Montreal, when was that? 1976, if I'm not mistaken. But Montreal has not yet paid back all the debt when it borrowed to hold those games. Well, I think that now we can have many examples that it is exactly local communities, either within the city or town, are now questioning. For protests in Brazil, for example, or in my country, for example, an idea which seemed to me just like abstract to organize a Winter Olympic Games in Krakow, which never has seen any snow. But this was also discussed at the local referendum. People are now less emotional and more rational about looking at such prospects. Please, another colleague from Krasnodar. Andrei Filimonov from Krasnodar. My question is about what you presented, the materials. The sources of global growth that were enumerated. I would like to hear the correlation of these sources between themselves, just for, in case of developed countries and in case of, say, emerging markets. What is the ratio? Well, just what do you mean? What do you mean specifically? Well, I mean is just these sources which were enumerated by you of the global growth. What is the breakdown, say, between what is the share of the developed market and the emerging markets? Then can I go back to this? When I showed you that has to do with labor resources, then here the main, in global economy scale, the main supplier of labor resources would be Africa, South and Central Asia, and the Middle East. As to investment, so far, while the main investor here is just, the main burden falls on in China and India, but here sooner it's mostly a matter of statistics that is obsolete. What will come next, it's not clear. But I still think that countries of East and Southeast Asia and Africa, they will take over in the very near prospects the main burden of investment. And this is something that probably will help address this question of employment, of the labor resources that are to spare, that are not yet engaged. Well, colleague in the second row sitting next to the interpreters both, please, you now have the floor. Chukaev Alexander from Tula. Mr. Dabrowski, thank you very much for your presentation. Tell me, please, recently we have heard this informal group of countries that is known as MINT, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria and Turkey, which show nice economic growth factors. these countries, can they in the long run become something like one of the economic global growth engines? Well, you know, this is all inventions, and I would put this way, by financial analysts. BRICS from the very start was like this, and BRIC then BRICS, and nowadays they've come up with this mint. In case of BRICS, you can say that still gradually they set up certain infrastructure. There are some intergovernmental meetings and like this. But it's clear that the equation of development of, say, China, India, Russia, Brazil and South Africa, they're all different. They face different problems, but in case of the countries that you named, meant they have even more diverse and group, and homogeneous group. And as far as I understand, there is nothing in terms of political links, economic problems, again, that they face are different. Turkey faces different problems, something very different as compared to Nigeria, but has nothing in common. But again, it would be interesting for the readers, for the listeners, this analytical approach matters most. Dear colleague, you now have the floor. Andrei Berezhnoy from Mineralные Vody in the Caucasus. I would like to hear your comments about the prospects to reform the International Monetary Fund, IMF. What do you mean? Including quotas? Well, as to quotas, well, this process is underway. But it's they're now reconsidering the quotas, but certainly it meets resistance, especially from Europe, that because its share in the global economy is going down, more in favor of Asia, Africa, it should return some quotas, but it's not very keen. But the latest contract and agreement that was achieved in 2010-2009, so far it is yet they froze it, sort of, because the US Congress has not ratified this agreement, this treaty, and the United States maintain majority package. They need it to be ratified by the countries which have over 80% of quota and has like 15%, and the main problem there is this internal conflicts between the Republicans and Democrats in the US Congress. And I would put it this way, historical distrust, especially of the right wing of the Republican Party in the IMF. They're not happy with the IMF and the World Bank. Maria Gulova. Thank you very much. Maria Guleva from St. Petersburg. I have a short question. I wanted to find out, in your slide you have seen investment into Chinese economy. As far as I know, quite a significant role of the so-called Huaqiao. It means the Chinese who live abroad. In the Chinese economy, we could include Taiwan and Chinese who live in Australia, America and other regions of the world. Well, could you comment on this? How important is this role of return investment from their compatriots? Well, I've never analyzed the structure of investment into China from who is an investor. It seems to me that probably from the perspective of technological progress and governance and management methods, this matters a lot. And as far as I understand, the role will be even greater, say 15, 20 years ago, when in practice the first external investors were investors who were of Chinese origin, but not formally in China. Now they have more global companies who come to China. But from the perspective of macroeconomics, we should remember that China still maintains pretty high surplus of the current payment balance. It means that investment is is less than savings, it means that China exports goods. It's a pure exporter of capital, and this capital export happens through its channels of the Bank of China, which tries to prevent the strengthening of yuan and wants to have large-scale interventions in the market, but the exchange rate is fixed. Not at all times, but it's still fixed. So it increases. We can look up any statistics, and they're growing very rapidly, currency reserves of the Bank of China. And these reserves are placed in the international markets first and foremost in the treasury bonds, T-bonds of the United States. So this is how they export part of savings and of capital from China. But if we look at the flow of investment, now this is where I don't really remember the exact figures, but this is where foreign investment do play a role in China. Yes, this is the case. Dear colleagues, our time is up, given that today it's day 4, or rather 5, especially those who love barbecues, they feel ill at ease right now because they stayed up late, and we should say a few words about our expert. Mr. Dabrowski travels, unfortunately, not so often as we would want him to see here, but it's not our expert, it's our long-time expert, long-standing expert. I don't remember, Marek, when we've met you first. Was it 15 years ago that you first spoke at the school? Well, I first visited Golitsyno, when was that? On the eve of the second round of the presidential election, 1996. Yes, it was 1996. So it's a great economist as well as an expert, veteran expert here. And I want you to give him a round of applause. Enjoy your meal. We have 1 hour lunch break. Thank you.